Now, at the beginning of this video, I talked about the necessity of having strong finishing mechanics for any submission hold, triangles in particular. We're going to start looking now at what I believe is the king of the triangles. There's 5 triangles, but one of them is king. This is a Mote Senkaku, the front triangle. This is the one most of you are familiar with already, and the one which most people tend to assume is the only triangle. What I want to do is to go through my own interpretation of the finishing mechanics of this stranglehold so that you can employ it against strong resistance and overcome some of the most common problems associated with front triangles. As a coach, every day I get athletes coming up to me saying, "John, the triangle's not for me. My legs are too short. I can't do it. I don't have the flexibility," 1,000 excuses, okay? Now, I'm not going to lie to you. Body type does play a role in your overall jiu-jitsu game. It definitely does. Anyone who denies that is just not being honest. And there are limits upon what your leg length can do. If you're 5'1" and your opponent's 6'4" and very broad through the shoulders, it's unlikely you're going to be able to lock a triangle successfully on them in a competitive situation. That should be obvious to all of you. But it's my contention that if your mechanics are good, there's a lot you can do to get around this problem of short legs. Okay, I'm 5'11". I have short legs for my height. One of my legs is crippled and I have a hip replacement, but I can still lock a perfectly good triangle. And I'm confident that if your mechanics improve through the elements we're about to look at, you'll be locking a lot more triangles on a lot bigger people than you were previously. Let's start off with my take on the front triangle and the mechanics involved in it. Okay? There's always been traditional ideas about how to finish a front triangle, and one of the most common you'll see is people getting used to the idea of locking a triangle and pulling down on the head. There's nothing wrong with that. It can definitely work, and it's worked well in the past. But I will come back to the idea of pulling down on the head. I don't believe it's the first thing you should be looking at. I believe there are things you can do before you need to pull down on the head, which will greatly facilitate your front triangle success rates. Let's look at it at an angle which will make it easier for you as viewers to watch this. We have a training partner here on 2 knees, and we've locked up an initial trap triangle like so. Okay, what's required for me to be successful here with the front triangle? Well, one of the big things is the idea of angle, okay? If I'm directly in front of my training partner, you will see that Mateus's shoulder is still visible right there. If we shift to an angle, Mateus. Here you can see I've locked a trap triangle and Mateus's shoulder is still visible inside my legs, okay? The more Mateus's elbow comes down to the side and the more he pushes his shoulder forward, the harder it becomes for me to transition to a figure of 4. Why? Because the volume that I'm trying to lock inside my triangle is increasing. And as a result, my legs are becoming too short to lock a successful figure of 4. Okay? Remember, to lock a figure of 4, my shoelaces must be inside the crook of my knee. Now, the circumference of that area inside the triangle is relatively small. Okay, if my opponent's very broad-shouldered, I have to start lengthening my legs and I get a less and less efficient triangle. So what I always look to do is to create situations where the volume that I'm trying to hold inside my legs diminishes. At a minimum, it will have to be my opponent's head, especially the area around the neck, and one arm. But I don't want to include the shoulder. The mass of the shoulder means that I have to surround a bigger and bigger element. It's harder and harder for me to do, and I need longer and longer legs to do so. So what we always want is to create situations where my strangle leg, I have a strangle leg and a support leg. Okay, strangle leg, as the name implies, it's the one that actually goes on Mateus's neck and strangles him, and the other one locks my strangle leg in place. It plays a supporting role, so it's a support leg. Okay, I want to bring my strangle leg all the way across my training partner's neck. Okay, so we pull in a way where it goes perpendicular to our training partner's spine. The more my leg lines up with Mateus's spine, the less efficient my triangle will be. So I always want that idea of perpendicularity on my training partner, so that my shin stays above my opponent's shoulder line. And it's from here that I'm going to be successful with my triangles. Again, the more my foot points down his back in alignment with the spine, the more leg length I need. The more I come out and get myself in a situation where my calf muscle goes across the line of the shoulders, the less dexterity and leg length I need to get the stranglehold to work. I'm just going to bring a third person onto the stage so we can observe these characteristics. We're going to have Matthias apply a triangle on Placido. Let's understand terminology here. We have a strangle leg, which is, as the name implies, responsible for the strangle itself. It covers the carotid artery on one side. Placido's shoulder will cover the other carotid artery. Once we go to lock the figure of 4 in this position, what Matthias needs to do is to keep his strangle leg, the calf of the strangle leg, above the shoulder line. If we just unlock for a second, the shoulder line, just keep your head in place, is the line that joins my training partner's two shoulders. Matthias must keep his leg above that line. The lower leg of the strangle leg must stay above the shoulder line. If Matthias's leg comes down below the shoulder line, when he goes to lock the figure of 4, you will see it's an incomplete triangle. It's only half of the triangle. You can't get all the way up where he needs to be. Okay. However, if he keeps everything well above the shoulder line, it's so easy for him to put his shoelaces inside the crook of his knee and get to a successful strangle. Okay. So what I want to see you guys doing as athletes is observing your opponent's shoulder line, and everything in the strangle leg stays above that line. Okay, everything we do in this position is built up around this idea of angulation, so that if we have the spine here, Matthias's strangle leg, the lower part of his strangle leg, will always be perpendicular to the spine. Okay, so the iron rule that we work with, and you will often hear me screaming this as a coach: stay above the shoulder line, stay above the shoulder line. There's the shoulder line in place. We take our lower leg and everything is locked up above the shoulder line. Okay, now thank you guys, let's just, both of you can stay here. Now let's introduce a second keys concept. First concept, everything on the lower leg stays above the shoulder line. Now the absolute most important mechanical element to the front triangle, the idea of eliminating the shoulder. The best way for me to demonstrate this is by having two people here, and I'll point out what it means to say to eliminate the shoulder. Okay, remember, we want even short-legged people to be successful with triangles. Okay, so if I have a training partner in here, I want to minimize the circumference that I'm trying to wrap my legs around. That means my opponent's head and one arm. Okay, the more Placido's shoulder drives forward, the wider the area that I'm trying to cover with my legs. And now I have to resort to pulling down on the head and all kinds of things like this. Okay? I want to eliminate his shoulder out of the equation. The only way I can do this is by forming an angle where my knee goes directly in front of his deltoid. So here you can see my right leg is above the shoulder line, and my left knee is directly in front of his deltoid. There's a sense in which you physically cannot see his shoulder. If you can see Placido's shoulder, that's not good. That's a terrible thing. Now I have a very poor looking triangle. A good application of any front triangle will mean that from the camera's point of view, the shoulder disappears. And from this situation, only the head and one arm is caught in my triangle. The volume that I'm catching inside my triangle is very small, and as a result, even short legs like mine have an easy time covering my opponent. But if the shoulder pushes forward and becomes visible, now my short legs, you can clearly see, I struggle now to apply a proper triangle in this situation. I always want my knee in front of his shoulder. When his shoulder disappears from view, from that front perspective, you know now we have a very, very tight triangle to work with. So these key elements, this idea of always working above the shoulder line and making our opponent's shoulder disappear from view, the sense of eliminating the shoulder, are two of the key mechanical elements. Let's demonstrate it now with two athletes working here in a triangle. Let's shift our body around to this angle so that it comes right in front of the camera. As the shoulder comes forward and he locks a triangle, you can clearly see that the shoulder is inside the lock of Mateus's legs. It's right there inside the triangle. Okay, it's visible to the camera quite clearly. If Mateus takes his leg around the corner and places his knee and thigh in front of the shoulder, now when he locks, the shoulder is outside of the triangle. The shoulder has been eliminated from the triangle itself. That's the key you're looking for. Okay, again, if the shoulder drives forward and we don't have angle, you can clearly see the shoulder is contained within the lock of the triangle. That's a terrible thing, and now it means the bottom man is, unless he has very long legs, is condemned to a more or less failed triangle. It's easy to counter. However, if we form angle and we get the strangle leg up above the shoulder line, now when we lock, you can clearly see the shoulder is outside the lock of the triangle. The only thing contained within the triangle are the head and the arm. And as a result, Mateus has an easy time locking a very tight figure of four and a successful stranglehold. Thanks. So, what's our game here? Our game in all the triangles, but the front triangle in particular, is always to eliminate the shoulder from the triangle. You want to lock your opponent's head and arm, but not the shoulder. Remember, the lock of the triangle itself is actually a very narrow space. It has to be. It's a stranglehold after all. If it was too loose, it wouldn't strangle anybody. So when I go to lock up a triangle, you can see the actual gap of the triangle is a relatively small space. It's only slightly wider than my forearm. Okay? So it has to be a narrow space, otherwise it wouldn't be an effective strangle mechanism. If your opponent is very broad through the shoulders, it's going to be hard to lock a triangle unless you have very long legs. So always what we're looking to do is to create situations where that shoulder gets taken out of the triangle. If its shoulder is in front of my thigh, I've included his shoulder in the triangle. Now it's going to require extraordinary leg length on my part to finish the triangle. But if I form an effective angle that puts my thigh in front of his shoulder so that his shoulder is now outside the lock of my triangle, now even short, stumpy legs like my own can easily lock the figure of four and get to an effective stranglehold. So our first two key mechanical details for the front triangle are the idea of staying above the shoulder line with the strangle leg, and this critical idea that we'll come back to time and time again throughout this video, the idea of eliminating the shoulder from the triangle. If we can do those two things, our success rate is going to go up immediately. Now we're looking at the mechanics of a good front triangle. Let's go now to the positioning of our strangle leg. This is super important. If you guys were doing rear naked strangles with your arms, you would be very particular about the position of your elbow relative to your opponent's carotid arteries. We saw that in the back system. And yet it's quite shocking when you look at triangle attempts. People are not particular at all about where they place their leg when it's time to strangle. You should be just as particular about your knee position when you go to triangle people as you are about your elbow position when you go to strangle with your arms. It makes a big difference. Now, let's have a look at this in the case of a front triangle. First, as always, let's make a strong distinction between our strangle leg and our support leg. Okay, I've got two legs involved in a triangle. One is to strangle the guy, the other one is to support my strangle leg. So we have a front triangle like so. Here's one of the most common mistakes I see in the sport of jiu-jitsu when it comes to triangles. People place the crook of the knee too high. They place the crook of the knee on top of their training partner's ear. This is a classic mistake, okay? The moment my knee goes above the ear, my chances of a successful strangle go down considerably, okay? I'm not going to say it's impossible, but you definitely have gone down in likelihood. Now, from here, because my knee is so high, it's very easy for my opponent to start posturing actions and protecting his carotid artery. Okay, and from here it's hard for me to get a good finish. What I always want to do is take the crook of my knee and put it below his ear. You see there's a massive difference in strangle power between my knee above the ear and below the ear. The ideal is to place the actual fold of my knee directly upon my training partner's carotid artery. That's the ideal. This has a remarkable effect. It means that once we turn into an angle, it places my other knee as a perfect wedge behind his head. It means that when I go to lock my triangle, for the first time, the lock is directly behind my training partner's head. Here. As opposed to the way most people do, where the lock of the triangle is behind the shoulder. When the lock of the triangle is behind the shoulder, it's very easy for my opponent to posture up and break my triangle. When the lock of my triangle is directly behind his head, even when he postures up and stands up off the floor, you can go, Mateus, stand up all the way, my triangle doesn't come undone. And the stranglehold is absurdly powerful. Just watch my left foot turn out to the side, and the strangle comes on immediately. When I go to apply the triangle with my feet locked behind the shoulder, not only is there too much mass inside my triangle, the shoulder's still inside the triangle, it's very easy for my opponent to posture, but when I go to squeeze my legs, I can't get an effective contraction. My opponent's elbow going in this direction shuts down my opponent, and I can't get any kind of strangle to work. The moment I shift my knee underneath his ear, now the lock of my triangle is directly behind the head. When he goes to posture up and move away, it means nothing. And the stranglehold can be applied in a heartbeat. If you want to dramatically increase the effectiveness of your stranglehold with triangles from the front, get the knee of the strangle leg below the ear. This will dramatically increase the efficiency of the strangle and dramatically reduce the likelihood of posturing defenses on the part of your opponent. So the great watchword here is get your knee of the strangle leg below his ear and lock your triangle behind the head and neck rather than behind the shoulder. You do these two things and watch your finishing percentages go up as a result. We're looking at the critical details of the mechanics of a good stranglehold in front triangle, or a mote senkaku. We've seen a bunch of details about shoulder line, eliminating the shoulder, etc., etc. I want to look now at one of the small details that makes a concrete difference in your performance. This is the use of my inner leg on my opponent's tricep, and how most people get the positioning of their inner leg in the wrong position and in a way which definitely detracts from their performance. If we have Mateus in front of us on two knees and we're working with a triangle, okay, I always want to ensure that the inner part of my thigh works at Mateus's tricep, not at the lat muscle. This is a critical detail. Anytime my inner thigh is locked to my training partner's lat muscle, this is an opportunity for him to posture up, and it's hard for me now to maintain the integrity of my triangle. Whenever we go to work into a triangle, I want to take my inner thigh and bring it to his triceps. When he goes to pull away, everything's locked in. He tries to pull his arm out, everything's locked in by that inner thigh positioning. Now, when I go to lock the triangle itself, you can clearly see his shoulder is outside the lock of my legs. And as a result, we get a very good strangulation. Okay. Again, if my inner thigh is on his lat muscle, you are condemning yourself to a likely failure before you've even begun. It is absolutely critical that when I turn the corner on my training partner, my inner thigh come brushing along the tricep muscle. so that when I set my legs, my strangle leg is well above the shoulder, and you can clearly see his shoulder is outside my triangle, and we get a successful finish. Now, what's the right way to get this done? A very simple rule. I want my two lower legs to point forwards. You can clearly see my two lower legs are currently pointing down towards his hips. I want my two lower legs pointing in the opposite direction. So I throw so that my 2 feet are pointing forwards. This ensures that my inner thigh is against his triceps. When he goes to yank out, it's so difficult. And as a result, when we lock the figure of 4, it's an unusually tight stranglehold from the onset. This critical detail of making sure that our inner thigh is locked against the tricep, not against the lat muscle, makes a huge difference when it's time to apply a successful stranglehold in a combative situation. Earlier in this video, I said that one of the chief skills that you are going to need to develop as someone who's interested in mastering the triangle is the transition from a trap triangle where my ankles are locked to a figure 4 triangle where we actually put the shoelaces of our foot underneath the hollow of our knee. If you're going to lose a triangle, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be during that transition, when you're trying to go from the trap triangle to the figure 4. The moment you land a trap triangle on a knowledgeable opponent, he's going to go into a series of strong defensive reactions designed to break that trap triangle and get him out of there. You're going to have to prevent that from happening and fight your way to the actual stranglehold. Let's look now at the case of the front triangle, Omote Senkaku, and how we can successfully manage this transition from the initial trap triangle all the way through to a good stranglehold. We've seen the mechanics of the stranglehold. Now let's look at managing the task of getting from trap to stranglehold. The first thing I want to look at is how to control your opponent's posture. It's probably fair to say that 9 times out of 10, your opponent's first reaction to the threat of a triangle are postural responses, where they try to bring the head up and move away. So if I go directly into a trap triangle, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out this man's in trouble. Okay, and he will immediately recognize the potential danger, and they all start putting hands on board and pushing the head up and looking to pop my feet apart. Okay, and if he can put sufficient pressure up to the ceiling, that's the result. My triangle comes undone. Okay, so we have to be able to prevent him from posturing. Okay, 2 good ways to do that right from the start. My favorite way of doing it is through a single collar grip. Okay, I don't like grabbing 2 hands on too early. I know it's a popular thing in current jiu-jitsu, but I usually have one hand to scoop the legs that we'll be looking at shortly, and one hand to hold the head. Okay. From here, I'm always looking to turn to an angle so I can get my arm inside my training partner's leg and turn to an angle. Okay. I can't do that if 2 hands are on. This does create a strong strangle, but it condemns me to staying directly in front of my opponent, which means he can go into other forms of defense like stacking, which will unlock my triangle. So what we're always looking to do is to get one hand on the back of our training partner's head. The second hand becomes a scoop grip inside my opponent's leg and scoops all the way inside the leg like so. When my opponent goes to posture up, this grip on the back of the head makes it exceptionally difficult. And I now have an ability to turn my body around and form angle advantages, which enable us to lock up a tight triangle. The second method of gripping, also very good, is for me to hold my own shin. This has the advantage of forming a locked and reinforced wedge around both sides of my opponent's head. When my opponent goes to yank out, again, it's a difficult thing, and it's relatively easy for us to use that same action of turning up to the side, and then we get the lock of the triangle directly behind our training partner's head for good results. Let's perform the same elements at a different angle so you can see what's happening here. We're trying to coach this idea that once we enter into a triangle, posture is going to be your opponent's first form of defense. If he goes up with the head, my triangle suffers. So we always want to get some kind of initial control over our training partner's head. My second hand scoops inside my opponent's leg and gets angle, like so. This takes my lower back off the ground. Okay? From a situation like this, when he goes to posture, the hand on the head makes it difficult. An alternative is for me to hold my own shin. When he goes to posture up, again, very, very difficult. My knee of the support leg here in front of the shoulder, making his shoulder disappear. As a result, it's an easy thing for me to lock the figure of 4 with my lock directly behind his head. When he goes to yank out, it's so difficult. And even the smallest application of force creates an immediate strangulation. This is the first element involved in a successful transition from the trap triangle that we begin with and the figure 4 triangle that we finish with. Now we're looking at this critical skill of managing the transition from a trap triangle that we begin with to the figure 4 triangle that you finish with. Let's understand something about triangles from the front. You got 2 legs and you got 2 arms, and you use all 4 of them. We have a strangle leg, we have a support leg. I have a posture arm, which controls my opponent's posture, and I have a scoop arm that goes inside my opponent's leg and gives me angle. The purpose of your scoop arm, as I just said, is to create angle on your opponent. As much as possible, I don't want to hit my triangles directly in front of people. Front triangles can be finished directly from the front, but they're also easily countered from the front. Unfortunately, you'll often see people successfully finish a front triangle from in front of a less experienced opponent, and people think, oh, it worked, so it must be good. No, it'll work up to a certain level and then stop working. The best triangles are almost always done perpendicular to your opponent. That's always the ideal that we look for. Almost all of the major counters to triangles can be stopped if we find ourselves at a perpendicular angle. Let's have a look at this now and the role of my scoop arm and turning my body. Okay, so here we have Mateus in a trap triangle situation. Here's my strangle leg. Here's the support leg. Here's my posture hand in place, and now my angle hand scoops inside my opponent's leg. Okay. From here, I'm able to turn my body so that I form an advantageous angle. My lower back comes off the ground, my knees come to my chest. When Mateus goes to yank out, it's so difficult. And because of that superior angle, the moment I lock my triangle, the strangle is extraordinarily efficient because of the angle that I work at. Now, I'm going to show you 3 different places I can place my scoop arm. You're going to need all 3, because once your opponent realizes the incredible value of the scoop arm, he's going to do everything he can to stop you using it in the way you want. So I'll demonstrate on this side so you can see my right arm working. From any given triangle situation, there's my strangle leg, there's my support leg. There's my posture hand in place. First, I scoop elbow deep inside my training partner's leg. I pull my own ear around the corner to his knee. My 2 feet point forwards in the same direction that Mateus is pointing. As a result, when he goes to yank out, it's such a difficult thing. Okay? In a situation like this, it's so easy to cover the shoulder, lock my feet directly above his head, and form that good strangulation. Pretty soon, Mateus is going to figure out that if I get inside this leg, it's good for me and bad for him. So what a lot of your opponents will do is they'll bring this knee here backwards. And as a result, I can't scoop it anymore. Okay, let's change the angle so people can see what's happening here. I try to reach for the leg and he moves the leg away from me. If I see that, I simply switch scoops. Instead of using an inside scoop on the near leg, I go through and I form an outside scoop on the far leg, and I get exactly the same effect. My 2 feet point forwards, and as a result, we can lock the figure of 4 and form a good strangulation. Mateus can't pull both of his feet back. If he pulls both of his knees back and away from me, then there's no need for me to do anything. He's just giving me an easy stranglehold. Okay? He can only take one leg away at a time. If he takes away the first, then I come around the corner and go into the second. If he leaves me the first, then I'll just work right with that and go into the standard finishes. If for whatever reason I can't get to a leg, the next best option is a scoop grip on the arm. Not quite as good as a leg, but not bad either. I will scoop the arm and use that to turn my body. Once again, we find ourselves in the perfect position to lock the figure of four and get our finishes. So once again, the three uses of my scoop arm. The best, my favorite, is near leg. If you pulse near leg back, we go outside grip on the far leg. If for whatever reason I can't score either leg, then I'll scoop at my training partner's arm and form a good enough angle off that to get the job done. So there's three good places that I can utilize my scooping arm. Either inside the near leg, my favorite, outside the far leg, my second favorite, or underneath my opponent's arm. Not bad, and certainly good enough for the purposes of turning an angle and getting to a superior strangle. Okay, we're looking at the front triangle. We've been focusing on mechanics and body positioning. Some of the concerns that we've been looking at is the idea of leg length. So many people erroneously believe I have legs that are too short to hit a triangle. It's not for me. It's for long-legged, tall people. Of course, leg length does facilitate the use of triangles. No one's going to deny that. But my point is that when the legs are short, you can, in many, many cases, make up for this with good body positioning, which has to do with attaining a perpendicular angle on your opponent and keeping your strangle leg above the shoulder line, and the use of a scooping arm to form an effective perpendicular angle on your opponent so you can go in and get the finishes you're looking for. Ironically, short-legged people, when they actually do lock up a triangle, find they have a much tighter triangle than long-legged people. So there's a sense in which it's actually an advantage if you can get the right position. What we need to do as athletes is consistently eliminate the shoulder from the triangle. I can't have my opponent's shoulder inside the lock of my triangle. That's too much volume for my short legs to cover. So constantly what we're looking for is to keep everything above the shoulder line, turn to a 90-degree angle through the use of a scoop arm, and make our opponent's shoulder disappear. The crucial element here is the positioning of my strangle leg above my opponent's shoulder line and my support knee in front of his shoulder. I'm just going to quickly show exactly what I mean by this. From a front triangle type situation, I have my strangle leg, which goes above the shoulder like so. When I turn to an angle on my training partner, I physically place my knee here in front of my training partner's shoulder, so that from the perspective of the camera, you cannot physically see the shoulder anymore. If you can physically see the shoulder, that's a problem. That's why we bring the inner leg, the inner thigh, around the tricep. That facilitates the turn that makes the shoulder disappear and ensures that the only thing inside my triangle is my opponent's head and arm. And as a result, when I close my triangle, you get this tourniquet-like effect, which creates an incredibly tight strangulation. What I want to do now is to go through all the disparate elements that we've looked at as far as mechanics goes and put them all together into a package so you can see them operating and how they work together to create that tourniquet-like effect, that incredibly tight noose around your opponent's neck for tight, efficient strangulations. We start with the trap triangle, descend like so. We know that when we get to a trap triangle, it's about forming angle. Okay. One way I can initiate angle is through the turning off the shoulder, but at some point I've got to go in there and get a hold of my opponent's legs. From here, I start that turning action where my inner thigh brushes against my opponent's tricep. I control his posture with the single collar grip, just like so, and from here we go in and we've got the lock of our triangle directly above our opponent's head. That's always what we're looking for. If we can do these things, some magic starts to happen. That magic is the ability to shut down the standard defenses to the triangle. The first line of defense that your opponent has is always going to be posture. He's going to try to posture up on you. Okay? If I can lock my triangle directly above my opponent's head by coming through and forming a superior angle on my training partner. When he goes to posture up, he's working directly against the lock of the triangle. Okay? If he goes to the next phase of posturing, which is to stand up, it's so easy for me to hook inside my opponent's ankle and keep that lock in the perfect position. And as a result, we get a perfect strangulation. Another common form of defense for my opponent is for him to turn to an angle, like so, and put pressure on my triangle. This immediately reduces the strangulation effect that I can have. But if I scoop inside my training partner's legs and he goes to turn to that advantageous angle, it becomes almost impossible. And from here, the strangle will take effect. Another very common form of defense is for my opponent to take his elbow across and drive his elbow to the floor and split my triangle. That's one reason why I always like to have my opponent's arm caught underneath my arm like so. Ordinarily, people will tell you, in order to get a finish, you have to bring the elbow across the body. You'll probably be rather surprised that when I went through the various mechanical details of the triangle, I never included that. There's a reason why. Up to a certain point, it's a good idea for me to bring the elbow across. But if my opponent's experienced, he'll bring it further across and split my triangle. In fact, it's a common misunderstanding that you need to have the triangle in the center. You don't. In fact, there's advantages to having it trapped underneath my arm. There's a bunch of arm lock finishes that we can see from this position. We'll look at those shortly. And most importantly, when my opponent tries to bring the elbow to the floor, it's impossible. It's stuck in place. And it's an easy thing for me to use angle to go through on my opponent. And now the fact that his elbow is outside my body instead of across means nothing. From here, the strangulation power is off the charts. And we can easily go through and finish regardless of my opponent's elbow position. It's not essential that you bring the elbow across the body. What is essential is that you close your triangle around the smallest possible part of your opponent's head and arm and eliminate the shoulder. That's essential. Elbow position is optional. Let's start putting all these things together now into just a general movement, which will give you a general sense of what you're trying to do in these front triangle situations. Okay, so it all begins with the trap triangle. Okay, from here we're going to punch through and get a hold of our training partner's head. So as Mateus goes to posture up and away, it's a difficult thing. Okay, now we go in and we scoop a hold of our training partner's legs. I bring my lower back off the ground and my 2 feet point well forward. Okay, now I place a wedge behind my training partner's head. The wedge is still open. Okay, I haven't crossed my feet yet, so I need to hold the head. When he goes to yank out, it's a difficult thing because of that hand position, either here or here. They're both great options. As my opponent goes to twist and turn, etc., my body positioning makes it exceptionally difficult. I'm very mobile because my lower back is off the ground. And then from here, I go forward and up, and I make his shoulder disappear. So I turn my shoulders in. And then from this position, it's so easy to lock the figure of 4 and strangle efficiently. Okay, so once again, we start off in a situation where we get a trap triangle. We come up to the head, and we make that turn all the way around the corner, making sure that our inner thigh is all the way down by the tricep. And as a result, the wedge goes in. I go from open wedges to closed wedges. We lock the figure of 4. The wedges are now closed around the head and one arm. The shoulder is outside of my triangle. When he goes to stack me, it's impossible. And we can strangle in a heartbeat. When he goes to lift me up off the floor, standing up, I'm underneath the leg, and it's impossible to lift me off the mat, and the strangle is immediate. Okay? Done in this way, you can see that most of the standard defenses to triangle get taken care of just through good body position. And you'll have a lot more chance to break through as you manage that transition from the trap triangle to the figure 4 triangle. We're looking in a lot of detail at the key elements behind a truly tight front triangle or a mote senkaku. My ambition is for you as a viewer to have a triangle so tight it feels like a tourniquet around your opponent's neck. All day, I look across gyms around the nation and I see people locking the beginnings of a triangle. And you see fiddling, moving this way, that way, and there's no real tightness to the lock. It doesn't really look like the person's strangling, and then inevitably there's an escape. What I want is for you to be able to move very quickly and very efficiently from a trap triangle to a lock so tight your opponent is tapping in a matter of seconds, and there's no need for you to do any of the traditional things like pulling down on the head or arching your spine up off the floor. None of these things are necessary, just because the sheer mechanical precision of the lock. Now, I'm going to talk to you now about one of the really key elements behind my approach to front triangles. This is the idea of unified legs. You've got two legs involved in the stranglehold. It's important they work in unison rather than against each other. Let's have a look at what I mean by this. Okay, we've got Mateus in a basic trap triangle from the front, okay? And our feet are locked, and we know now we want to turn to an angle, etc., etc. One of the biggest problems that I see is people will make a good turn to an angle, but they'll do a bad job with their leg positioning. It looks something like this. Okay, we turn off the shoulders, out like so. What I want, what is desirable, is that my two lower legs point in the same direction. The more my lower legs share the same direction, the less work I have to do to actually lock a triangle. In addition, the harder it becomes for my opponent to escape. For example, if I have my two lower legs pointing in the same direction, I don't have a triangle here. You can see my legs are not locked. They're just pointing in the same direction. When Mateus postures up, the integrity of my triangle formation is kept. However, if my two lower legs point in different directions, okay, out like so, this kind of thing, now it's a joke. Mateus postures, and there's no resistance behind. Okay? Anytime my lower legs point in opposing directions, bad things start to happen. We always want the two lower legs pointing like arrows in the same direction. When there's unity between the two lower legs, it's so easy for us now to close the figure of four and strangle. So when we go to work for any given triangle, the first thing we like to do is get those lower legs pointing in the same directions. As Mateus goes to yank out now, it's so difficult. You can clearly see that his shoulder is outside of the triangle, and now minimal work has to be done to make the lock. And as a result, the strangle will take place immediately. Okay? So once again, when we start that turn off our training partner's body, I don't want my legs pointing any which way. I want my two lower legs pointing in the same direction. Only now do we have an effective wedging around our opponent's head and an easy transition into the finishing lock. So let's get those lower legs working in unison, sharing direction so that it's hard for our opponent to pull out as we're managing that transition from the trap triangle to the figure four triangle. A crucial theme that I want to push on you when it comes time to apply your front triangles is that of getting your lower back up off the ground and getting onto the points of your shoulders. A very common problem I'll see when I'm working with students and they're trying to develop their triangles is they'll work with their lower backs on the floor. Okay? If I come in here and lock a triangle and my buttocks and lower back are on the mat, any stacking on the part of my opponent immediately unlocks my triangle. Okay, it's not even competitive. He just blows my legs apart very easily. The problem here is there's too much of my body on the ground. This has a bunch of bad effects. The first is it makes stacks, as we just saw, very, very effective. Any forward movement of his head towards my head just overloads my triangle, it's done. Second thing is, it's almost impossible to form an angle because there's so much drag on the floor. There's so much of my back on the ground that when I go to form an angle, I can barely move. Okay, there's just too much drag. In addition, it means if my opponent postures up, my body doesn't follow him. My lower back's on the floor. Okay, and as a result, the two most common reactions to a triangle, first, stacking is very effective. Second, posturing is very effective. And third, the thing that I need the most, which is to form an angle, is very difficult because there's so much drag on the ground that I can barely move in this position. A much better way for me to operate is to come up on the points of my shoulders and get my lower back off the ground. This is going to have a bunch of very good effects. The first and most obvious effect is that when my lower back comes off the ground, there's very little friction. And as a result, I can start to turn underneath my opponent. Remember, when it's time to enter into a triangle, my feet begin facing down the body. But when it's time to go, I want my feet facing forwards. And from this position, now I can easily turn underneath them. And movement becomes very, very easy. In addition, it means that when I actually go to lock my triangle, when my training partner tries to stack me, he's going forwards into the stranglehold. My strangle doesn't break. If he continued to go forwards, he would actually get reversed over. That wouldn't be in his best interests. If my opponent goes to posture up, I'm hooked into the legs so securely, and even if he does get up to his feet, it means nothing. I stay hooked in, and now the lock of the triangle is directly behind his head, and it's very, very hard for him to get away. So as much as possible, I want to see you getting away from the idea of your lower back lying down flat on the floor. That's going to be a very, very bad effect on your success rate with triangles. Let's get used to the idea of coming up onto the points of our shoulders and doing work from in here. Just as we did at the start of this video, when we looked at the idea of those simple physical exercises which enable us to work in situations where my weight is all on the shoulders, and as a result my hips become very, very light and my legs become very mobile. If we can do these things, we can start to turn efficiently underneath people, and off any given setup to a front triangle. From here, it's an easy thing now to make those turns. When he goes to posture up and pull away, etc., it's so difficult. And from here, the strangles come on fast and furious. So let's get that lower back up off the ground. Let's get up on the points of our shoulders and get to that angle. If you can add these to the various elements we've looked at so far, you're going to be finishing a lot of people with front triangles from bottom position. Now it's time to go from finishing mechanics to actually getting to a triangle. Okay, you guys know now a lot about finishing mechanics. Now it's actually time to get to a position where you can start finishing people. It's one thing to have finishing mechanics, but you've got to be able to get someone who knows what a triangle is and put them in the position so you can actually win. Let's start off with a very simple reflection. The story of every triangle is always the same. It's just two key elements. First, you have to be able to create a situation where one of your opponent's arms is caught inside your triangle and one of his opponent's arms is locked outside of it, the one in, one out position. From there, we lock up what we call a trap triangle, where my opponent's head and arm are caught inside my locked legs. So that's step one. Step number two is pulling my opponent in and adjusting my body from a trap triangle to a figure four triangle, so that we can employ all those fancy mechanical elements that we just looked at in the previous sections. So there's always two chapters to the story of a triangle application, regardless of type. We happen to be looking at the front triangle, but it applies to all triangles. First, create a trap triangle. Create a situation where one of your opponent's arms is caught inside the triangle and one is locked outside of it. Once you get the trap triangle, chapter 2 comes in. The transition from trap triangle to figure four triangle, where you can actually strangle somebody. Let's have a look at this right now in the case of the front triangle from bottom position. We have a training partner in front of us. We use any one of the many setups that we'll be looking at later in this video to actually pull someone into a triangle. Our first thing is to create a situation where one arm is outside my legs and one arm is inside my legs. Mateus's right arm is obviously inside my legs, obviously his left arm is on the outside, and from here it's an easy thing to lock up that trap triangle. Now, his whole thing is going to be to get away from the situation. He wants to split my feet apart. Okay? So initially we want to have locked feet, just like so. The first thing we do in this situation is counteract his ability to posture. His best escapes in this position all involve the idea of posturing up and breaking my feet apart. So what we want to engage in first is what we call a knee pull. Pretty simple. My opponent goes to pull away. My whole thing is to pull in with my knees to chest. Okay? That's why we put such a precedence, such an importance upon this idea of pulling in with the legs. That's why earlier on in this video, we did so much work with this idea of folding the body, where our body constantly folds over. So we get used to this idea of knees to chest, which creates a strong pull inwards with our trap triangle. So as we come in here and we lock up on our training partner, he goes to pull away. Our whole thing is to pull in with the knees. And that brings his head close enough to me that we can get that single collar tie just like so. Okay? That leaves us the scoop arm that we're looking for. And as a result, we can start that action of turning and from here go into the finishes that we look for. Okay? So our first thing is this idea of creating this trap triangle. And then from there, using the knee pull to control the distance between us, bringing his head in close to our sternum. So we go in on our training partner. From here, we've got the 1 in, 1 out situation. One arm is in, one arm is out. As I close over my training partner, we get that trap triangle. There it is. 1 in, 1 out. Now from here, he goes to pull away from me. There's the knee pull. It's a battle between my knees to chest versus his head up and away. All I need is to bring his head within the distance of my wrist. Not my hand, my wrist. I have to curl around the head. Okay, as he goes to pull up and away, I just pull him with one hand. Now I can unlock my trap triangle safely. He goes to posture up. He's held by the hand. The scoop hand goes in, and that's what gives us the angle we need to put the wedges in behind his head. Our two lower legs are pointing in the same direction. So when he goes to yank away, everything's locked in place. And from here, the lock of our triangle is in, and it's done. Once you get used to that simple two-step pattern, and you start to see it in the emergence of every triangle you hit, whether it be front triangle, back triangle, reverse triangle, it doesn't matter. They all work on that same pattern, that same two-chapter story. Get 1 in, 1 out, secure a trap triangle. From there, finagle your way from the trap triangle to the figure 4 triangle and get that strangle to work. Employ the finishing mechanics that we've looked at so far, and you'll be finishing a lot of people. Now, we've been looking a lot at finishing front triangles. Now it's time to look at getting into front triangles. I've got something to say about this. When I teach front triangles, even to beginners, I don't do it the way most people do. When I was a white belt student, I was taught front triangles from a supine position, lying flat on my back, closed guard. And I think it's fair to say that's probably about how 90% of people learn their first triangle stranglehold. Closed guard, supine position. So if you go into any beginners classes around the world, you will see people working from, say, a closed guard situation. My back is flat on the ground. And you'll see any one of a number of setups where people go into triangles, and from here they go to work and lock up in the usual fashion. And that's how most people get introduced to the triangle. I don't do that. When I first start working people seriously on triangles, I don't like to have them start in supine positions. I like to have them start in seated positions. Why? Because the seated position offers much greater mobility. And as you've seen from what I've shown so far, mobility is a big part of my approach to the triangle. The ability to turn and move and get your lower back off the ground and spin on your shoulders to be able to finish people in triangles and get to an advantageous angle. It's also much easier for me to move both myself and him when I'm in a seated position. And that too is a very important thing when it's time to enter into your triangles. My point is this. It's much easier to move both yourself and your opponent in ways that set up the 1 in, 1 out scenario that we're always looking for triangles from a seated position than it is from a supine position. And that's why I begin all of my front triangle training from bottom position, seated, not supine. Now, what we need is some kind of effective working grip, because nothing's going to happen until we get a grip on this guy. My favorite way of introducing people to effective entries into triangles from a seated position is through the use of 2-on-1 gripping. And ironically, it's also the set of grips which are most responsible for our triangle victories in competition. So not only is it a great introduction, it's also very effective in actual combat. Okay, let's talk about the idea of a training partner who's on 2 knees in front of us, just like so, and we are in a seated position in front of them. I want to get into a triangle. We know that the story of every triangle is the same. I've got to create a 1-in, 1-out scenario. I've got to put a situation where one of his arms is inside my legs and one of his arms is outside. Okay? My favorite way to initially tie up with people in ways that take us into triangles is variations on the 2-on-1. My favorite variation is the elbow 2-on-1, where I get a hold of my training partner's wrist and I push it to the center line and I put my hand in a pronated grip and lock in on my training partner like so. Okay? It's very hard for me just to go straight to a pronated grip because typically his hands are up and we're hand fighting like so. It's hard for me to get an angle on someone and grab like that. It's not really realistic. So typically what I do is I use my left hand to bring his right hand to the center line. Then my right hand goes in and secures the pronated grip, and then I go up my training partner's forearm and I take the elbow grip, where my thumb closes over the humerus bone and my 4 fingers control right on the cusp of the elbow. So when Mateus goes to yank away from me, it's surprisingly difficult. It becomes even more difficult when I take Mateus's wrist across my body to my right hip and bring my head forward and my own elbows close to my body. When Mateus goes to yank away, it's a very difficult thing because I'm taking the one weakness of my grip, which is for Mateus to pull his thumb back towards himself, and hiding it in my hip. Now when he goes to yank out, it's quite a difficult thing for him to achieve. Okay? Regardless of whether I work here or here, I'm in the ideal position now to start entering into triangles. Why? Because the seated position creates space between my chest and his chest. And that space enables me to be putting a foot here on my training partner's hip, on the same side as the trapped arm. If I put my foot up on the wrong side, Mateus can take ashigarami, good, and sit into my legs and cause problems for me. Obviously I don't want that. So I make sure that I always put the foot on the same side here, so there's no ashigarami. Now I take my free leg and I place it out here wide. My leg is unweighted. All of my weight is currently on my buttocks. So my unweighted leg becomes very mobile, and mobility is a key element. As Mateus tries to catch my foot, it's a difficult thing, and it's very easy for me to run circles around his hand and place my foot on the bicep and pull him in to the beginnings of the triangle. Okay, let's have a look at this from a different angle so you can see what's happening here. I'll have to talk over my shoulder to you. So, from here, we start off just like so. I need Mateus's hands on the center line so I can get a pronated grip. So left hand pushes to the center line. Right hand pronates, grabs in like so. Left hand goes through underneath and locks. Left foot goes on the hip. Now from here, this creates an unweighted leg. When Mateus tries to stop my entry into the triangle, it's so difficult. Okay, that unweighted foot goes to the bicep. I draw his elbow forward and my knee goes past his shoulder. Then in one motion, I throw my legs and go into the trap triangle. Now Mateus must bring his knees towards me to begin the action of posturing up. I pull in with my 2 knees so that I can get access to his head. We never, posture up, I never reach up to him. I bring him to me and lock. And as a result, it's an easy thing for us to get our scoop grip, turn the corner, put the wedges in place, and from here, we lock the figure of 4 directly behind his head. When Mateus tries to posture up, stand up, etc., it's so easy for us to get our finish. This is an incredibly effective and relatively simple way to enter into the front triangle. Let's have a look at it one more time. We have a training partner on 2 knees in front of us like so. From here, in our usual kind of butterfly guard scenario, we lock and take that pronated grip and secure the elbow 2-on-1. From here, I place a foot on the hip and I create an unweighted leg as he tries to catch the leg. It's such a difficult thing. And from here, we go up into a good attacking position. I throw my leg over the top, my legs unified, going in the same direction. Initially, I might lock my feet here. He goes to posture up. The knees pull in. We get a hold of our training partner's head and turn to a good attacking angle. From here, we lock the figure of 4 and we get the finish. Now, when it comes time to enter into triangles from a seated position, my absolute favorite method of doing so, it's not even close, not even competitive, is 2-on-1 gripping. Okay, 2-on-1 gripping is just an incredibly effective way to garner immediate mechanical advantage over your opponent on one side of his body. Now remember, if we have a training partner on 2 knees, what's required for a triangle is complete control of one of your opponent's arms and the head. Okay, the other arm we don't really care about, it's on the outside. So the 2-on-1 is absolutely perfect for this because it locks down 2 of my arms on one of his and confers a mechanical advantage. I don't care how big and strong he is, 2 of my arms are probably going to be stronger than 1 of his. Now, when we work in situations like this, we've seen the first 2-on-1, the one which I use the most by far and the one which I like to see my students employ the most, is an elbow 2-on-1 with a pronated grip. We probably use this one more than any other, but it's not the only form of 2-on-1 grip. There are many. Let's have a look at some of my favorites now. One which I will often use is a supinated 2-on-1, where I go in on my training partner and I secure the elbow first and I draw it towards me and I hold with no thumbs and I slap his knuckles to my chest. When Mateus goes to yank out, it doesn't look like much, but it's hell to get away because his hand can't come back to himself, it's blocked by my hand. He can't push forward because my chest's in the way, and his elbow can't move. So this is a very fast and very effective grip. So here we have a pronated 2-on-1, and here we have a supinated 2-on-1. If I hold with my thumb and just hold it midair, he can easily twist his hand out and be gone. But if I hug it to my chest, now when he goes to do the same, it's damn difficult. And from here, I place the foot on the hip, and once again, we're in a position where we can kick over the shoulder. Now we've created the 1 in, 1 out scenario that we're always looking for. Initially, I cross my ankles, he goes to posture up and away, we knee pull, and we get a hold of the head. Once we've got a hold of the head, now we're in a position to go through and start that action of locking up for our triangle. Once again, I'll show it from a different angle. Mateus is here in front. From here, look, I get the elbow. I draw the elbow across so his hand is on my center line. My hand comes around the corner and I hug into my chest. So when Mateus goes to yank out, it's a shockingly difficult thing to do. Now I place my foot on my training partner's hip. He goes to grab my leg to prevent the triangle and finds that incredibly difficult. And from here, we kick over the shoulder and we're in position to lock our feet. From here, he goes to pull away. I go knees to chest so I can access the head. Even if his head is upright, I can posture up. From here, you can always pull it in far enough that you can put your wrist on the back of the head. Now from here, we get our scoop grip inside the legs. We turn our body around the corner, and as a result, my triangle locks directly above his head. You'll notice that my knee points in towards his crotch. That's always the favored position. If my knee points up towards the ceiling, very hard to hit an effective triangle. But if my knee points inwards towards the crotch, even the smallest application of pressure has an immediate effect. So that's another form of 2-on-1 gripping, which I often employ. Let's move on now to another form of 2-on-1, which I greatly favor. Very often, you'll have an opponent who comes out and makes a strong collar tie. Not a bad thing for him to do, because now he can pull my head down and start putting me into front headlocks and passing my guard out of front headlock. So it's a good thing for him to do. However, I can punish that with a very interesting variation of 2-on-1 gripping. Whenever I see my opponent come in here, I lock right at the elbow and I take my second hand and I chop over the bicep and lock in like so. Initially, he wanted to grip on you, but once I take my grip on him, he wanted to grab me, now he can't let go of me. Okay, so there's a sense in which he came in looking for an authoritative grip and got locked up in one himself. So he takes his collar tie, I lock the elbow and I lock in over the top. When he tries to take his arm back, now the arm is mine. From here, I put a foot on my training partner's hip, I make my leg unweighted, and as a result, we can quickly pop up and cross our feet. As always from here, it's always that same story. We pull in with the legs, we get a hold of our training partner's head, we get that scoop grip inside the leg, we point our knee at our training partner's crotch, and as a result, we're in the perfect position now to lock the figure of 4. And from here, we've got a very, very strong strangle indeed. From a different angle now. We have an opponent here in front of us. He comes out and makes a strong collar tie. From this position, look, I hold the elbow, I come in over the top and hug in like so. When Matthias goes to pull his arm away, it's a very difficult thing indeed. My foot goes on the hip, we kick over the top, and we lock up our feet. From here, I pull in with the legs until I can access the head. As always, when we make that turn, we're always looking to get our knee pointing down to the crotch. Okay, and as a result, when we lock up the figure of 4, the stranglehold is immediate. Now, another form of 2-on-1, which I greatly favor. 2-on-1 wrist, my 2 hands pointing up, palm up to the ceiling. When do I use this form of 2-on-1? It's typically when my opponent has high hands. When my opponent has low hands down here, it's very easy to go into the regular 2-on-1s. But every so often you have a guy who has high hands. It's usually because they're trying to dominate your shoulders, like so. Okay? In these situations, we take a 2-on-1 wrist. So he dominates the shoulder, I come in and I lock, just like so. Now, that doesn't look like much of a grip, but here, one hand protects the weakness of the grip on the other. So when he goes to yank away, it's a surprisingly difficult thing. And from here, I put my foot on my training partner's hip, and as always, I draw him in and we lock up. As soon as I see my opponent trying to yank away and pull away, we pull him with the knees, we get a hold of the head, and from here, we spin, turn the corner, and again, the knee points in at the crotch. All the wedges are set in place, and as a result, when we lock the figure of 4, we get an enormously tight stranglehold. Let's have a look at that from a different angle. Again, we have a training partner here in front of us. I go in and I score that 2-on-1 wrist grip. From here, I put my foot on my training partner's hip. I create the unweighted leg, so even if he grabs my leg now, it's so easy for me to take the inside position with my foot. Hold tight. No matter how tight he holds, it's so easy. And as a result, we can quickly clear and then throw over the top. Now from here we start that action of pulling in. I get a good scoop grip on my training partner's head and leg. So I can turn, my knee points inwards to the crotch. My 2 lower legs are unified, both pointing in the same direction. The lock of my triangle is directly behind the head. Even as he goes to posture up and away, it's so difficult for him to get away from that stranglehold. And in this fashion, we can use 2-on-1 gripping to isolate one of your opponent's arms, lock it down long enough to throw our legs into a nice triangle position from a seated situation. I want to spend some time now focusing on one of my personal favorite uses of the triangle, Senkaku, in all of mat wrestling and jiu-jitsu. This is the use of the triangle against arguably the most common form of takedown in the sport, and also one of the most common forms of reversal. This is the single leg. So many times we'll find ourselves in situations down on the mat where my opponent shoots with a head to the inside single leg. Okay, it might be if he's in bottom position, for example, if he gets an underhook on me and he comes up into a single leg. It might be because we're in half guard top, my opponent scores an underhook and comes up into a single leg. It might be because we were grappling on the feet, and from here my opponent shot in, took the single leg, and we went down to the mat. Okay. However it happens, whether it come out of a takedown, whether it come out of an escape, whether it come out of a reversal from bottom guard, it's arguably the most common form of reversal takedown that we encounter in the sport. It's actually one of the best times for us to start using triangles as a counter. Let's look at first the front triangle as a counter to single legs down on the mat. We'll start in the single leg situation. As we've just seen, there's a dozen different ways that I can end up on a single leg. How he gets there is not that important. What is important is he's there, he's in on the leg, he's got 2 knees down on the floor, you're working on the mat, and he's looking to put you down on your back. How are we going to counter this with a triangle? The first method we're going to look at is a step over method. My opponent's in here on the single leg. We're going to put in a tight waist on our training partner just like so. I'm going to take my leg off the mat. If my two legs are on the mat, he can easily switch to a double leg and quickly put me down to a hip. That's going to screw everything up. So our first thing here is to stuff our training partner's head, put in that tight waist and separate our legs. Okay. Now I'm going to take my tight waist and my knee. I'm going to put my knee as a blocker next to Placido's elbow. My second hand is going to go on the floor and we're going to turn him over down to a hip, just like so. Okay. Make sure you stay up on your hand. Don't fall down with him. That's going to ruin everything. Okay. We need a height advantage here. My head and hips have to be higher than his when I enter into the triangle. So we want to make sure we base out on a hand, don't go down to an elbow, and certainly don't go down to a shoulder. So once again, he's in on the single leg. We come in just like so. Look how I stuff the head and I put my knee right there next to his elbow. I use a post hand and knock him down to the mat. I take my body around the corner and from here I physically pull his elbow up to my hip. Now in one motion I step my body across. My hand catches my training partner by the head. I switch hands to the floor and my knee comes around the corner just like so. Now we're in perfect position to put our head on the floor. We lock the figure of four in this position and we can easily strangle for the finish. Once again, we're in a situation where my training partner gets in on the single leg down on the mat. From here we put in a tight waist. We take our leg off the mat. We start the action of stuffing the head. Now from here I block my training partner's elbow. I put my hand on the mat and I put his hip down on the floor. Immediately I switch my two knees to one side of his body. I hike his elbow up just like so. So he's holding on to the single leg. From here I hike his elbow nice and high and I step my leg right over the top. Now we're in the perfect position to switch. Legs come around the corner, two knees in place, our head goes down to the floor, and there's our triangle for the finish. One more time. Our opponent comes up on the single leg, just like so. There's our tight waist, there's the head stuff, and there's his hip down to the floor. I bring everything around the corner, step over the top, and find myself in the perfect position to go forward into the triangle. The key element, head down to the floor, makes it easy for the lock, and either an arm lock or strangle finish. This is a great way for us, and a very practical way for us to use front triangle as a counter to the single leg down on the mat. Let's look at a second way that we can use front triangles against the single leg down on the mat. We've identified the single leg as probably the single most common form of takedown and one of the most common forms of reversal that we face whenever someone's coming at us down on the floor. Again, my opponent's in on the single leg, head on the inside, just like so. Okay. As always, we take our second leg up. I never offer him an easy switch to a double leg in these circumstances. Always we come up, we stuff in down on our training partner's head. This time we're going to go through into a quarter Nelson. Okay, two varieties of quarter Nelson, both very good. The first involves me posting on my training partner's head and then gripping my own wrist. My intention with any quarter Nelson is always to put his head underneath his own armpit and break him down to a hip. That's always what we're looking for. Okay, so once again, he's in deep on the single leg. We start by stuffing the head, and from here we go in. We use the head post method, and we put his shoulder and then his hip down on the floor. Okay, second method of quarter Nelson. This one is arguably a little stronger. From here, instead of posting on my training partner's head, I'm going to grab by the jaw, just like so. So I take a chin strap. Again, I come through. This time I grab not my wrist, but my forearm. And from here, you get a stronger lever action straight down to the mat. Okay. The truth is they're both highly effective. One is slightly stronger than the other, but they both work just fine. So once again, we've got an opponent in on the single leg. We're doing our usual thing, trying to square up to him, etc. We go to stuff our training partners here, and we go right into this turn that puts him down to a hip. Okay. Once we've put him down on the hip, we're going to turn the back of our hand onto the back of his head. So I had two hands on him like so. Now I go to one hand. From that one-handed situation, I block my training partner's hip and I start an action of walking around his body. As soon as we get to the body, I catch my training partner's wrist and head. And as a result, I'm able to throw everything across my training partner's body, put my head on the mat, and once again, we lock up for the triangle. Let's have a look at that from a different angle. My opponent gets in on the single leg, just like so. From here, we start off with that essential quarter Nelson that puts him down to a shoulder and a hip. I put the back of my hand on my training partner's head, and I start the action of walking around. As soon as I get into this position, I catch wrist and head. I lock my elbow to my own hip. So if Placido goes to pull his left arm out, it's wedged in place. And as a result, I can easily step everything in over the top and go forward and lock the figure of 4 for the finish. Again, we find ourselves on the receiving end of the single leg down on the mat. From here, we're always looking to stuff our training partner's head and apply that quarter Nelson. I move around the corner and I catch, step my leg straight in over the top, and there's the lock of the triangle. One more time. My opponent gets deeper on the single leg. As always, we look to stuff our training partner's head and break him down to the mat. We catch everything in place, the legs go through, lock, there's the figure of 4 and the finish. Okay? And this represents another highly effective way in which we can attack the single leg with front triangles. We've been looking at using front triangles against single leg takedowns down on the mat. Let's look now at a situation where my training partner's in on my leg and he's got a very, very strong grip indeed, and he's gotten elbow deep around my leg like so. Okay, so instead of being wrist deep, where we could apply an effective whizzer on our training partner, he's now elbow deep on the leg, and as a result my tight waist is less effective. It's hard for me to work here. His lock is above my knee and I feel like I'm getting trapped. Okay, in situations like this I will abandon the tight waist and the whizzer. Okay, and instead I will go through and seize my training partner by the tricep, and from this situation I take my elbow and I touch their elbow and I go around the corner. I put my foot right over their head, just like so. As they go to posture up in this situation, we come around the corner and find ourselves in a perfect situation now to apply the triangle. As always, from here, we lock up the figure of 4 and we get our strangle. Once again, from a situation where my training partner gets deep in on the leg, he's elbow deep on the leg and his lock is above my knee. So it's going to be very hard for me to apply a whizzer successfully or a tight waist. In these circumstances, I put my leg up, I abandon the tight waist, and I seize my training partner here by the elbow and tricep. I put my elbow right next to his, and I rotate with the intention of putting my foot on the back of his neck. That creates the perfect situation to come out on the other direction. Now, as always in these situations, we take everything across to the side, our foot comes wedging behind his the back of his neck, and as a result we get a clean strangulation. Once again, my training partner comes around the corner and locks up. His lock is above my knee and he's elbow deep in on the leg. No problem. From here we start the action of going through and around. I always recommend taking your hand first and seizing your training partner by the elbow and then putting your foot right on the back of their neck. That creates a good connection to work with. And from here, we find ourselves in the perfect situation to apply a stranglehold. A nice variation, which I often use in these circumstances, is to use not a front triangle, but rather the Hantai Senkaku, the triangle locked in what appears to be the wrong way. So my opponent comes in, same situation. Our tight waist is not effective here, so we seize him by the elbow. We go elbow to elbow. I put my foot right here on the back of his neck. I see my training partner posturing up. You'll notice his arm is on this side of my body. It is not centered. And as a result, this is a perfect opportunity for us to go around the corner and lock up the Hantai Senkaku. And from here, we get a very strong strangulation indeed. Whether you choose Hantai Senkaku or Omote Senkaku, the front triangle or the wrong-sided triangle, I leave that up to you. They're both great finishes in this situation. Now we've been looking at the single leg, probably the most common form of takedown and also one of the most common forms of reversal when we're down on the floor. We've looked so far at front triangles and wrong-sided triangles as a counter to the single leg. Let's make a switch now to Yoko Senkaku, the side triangle. This is another excellent way for us to use triangle strangleholds to counter someone who's a strong single leg wrestler down on the mat. Okay, we have an opponent who's gotten in on the single leg situation. From here, as always, we want to control our training partner's head and get our leg off the floor just like so. Okay. From here, we're going to come up with our body so that space separates. Normally we're down here like so. We come up just like this. Now I'm going to take my foot, I'm going to hook into my training partner's armpit, just like so. Once we get that hook in place, we're going to come back to the tight waist. I'm going to put my hand down on the floor and we're going to fall not to the side but to the rear corner, just like so. And as a result, we turn our training partner over. Now, the situation here is a little uncontrolled. Okay, so the first thing I like to do in these situations is to make sure we have a strong form of control through the use of Kimura lock. So I switch off to a Kimura on the near side arm. Now from here, our next thing is to lock a tight Senkaku on our training partner. The way we're going to do that, as always, is to put our thigh underneath our training partner's head and come up and go belly down and extend our right leg as far as it'll go into my training partner's armpit. So that when I come back and relock my triangle, we've got a good strangulation on our training partner. From here, we can always make adjustments with our opponent's far arm, but always I like to come back to the security of that original Kimura. And from here, we have a good stranglehold. Of course, like any Senkaku situation, you also have excellent arm lock finishes, wrist lock finishes, and finishes on both of your training partner's arms. Once again, in a situation where my training partner gets in on the leg, just like so. From here, we start off by pushing down on the head, posting, and taking our foot and hooking in so that my heel goes to my knee. Now we go in with a tight waist, and the directionality of the fall will be this way. Try to avoid falling right across your opponent's body. We want to sit back. So my hand goes out, and from here, we tilt our training partner over. As a result, we're in good position to lock up the figure of four. From this general situation, our first thing is always to come up so we can get our right leg into a deep position inside our training partner's armpit, so that when we come back into the figure of four, we get a very tight stranglehold for the finish. From another angle, our opponent goes in on the single leg, we go through and catch. So that you'll see my knee and my heel are very close together. There goes the tight waist. There goes the hand down to the floor. Here I've fallen across the body. That's a less desirable outcome. I want to fall more or less over here. Now when we lock up, look how my whole thing is to get this right leg in as far as it'll go. So I start by popping up. So when I come back into the stranglehold, the effects of the strangle are very quick. This is an excellent way for us to use the side triangle as a counter to single legs down on the floor. Now we've been looking at the issue of single legs down on the floor, and we're looking at Senkaku, the triangle, as a counter to single legs. Let's look now at one of my absolute favorite ways of countering single legs down on the mat. My opponent's deep in on the single leg, head on the inside, as we've been looking at so far. This time, instead of me putting my foot here for the Yoko Senkaku into the armpit, we're going to use a different method. Okay, we're going to put our body in a way where I hook in on my training partner and I start an action of slouching. So instead of falling over to the side, I start an action of slouching. Now from here, in this slouch position, there's nothing to stop me physically grabbing my foot and pulling it high up into my training partner's armpit. As a result, we can lock the figure of four directly in this position. Often there will be a period of adjustment where I use my hands to cinch the stranglehold tighter and tighter. The key point is that you want your heel directly in the armpit. The further your heel goes down the tricep, the less effective your strangle will be. So let's make sure we hike the foot high and we lock the figure of four, and we make whatever adjustments are necessary to lock everything in satisfactorily. Now from here, I go back to the waist and I apply my stranglehold. It's a very tight one under these circumstances. Now, let's go through these details again. Remember, you are sitting on your butt at this point, so you're taking something of a risk. You were on top and you went down to bottom. So if you're going to take this route, let's be sure we do it correctly. Once again, my training partner gets deep in on the leg. Okay, we stuff the head, separate our legs, and from here I take my heel into the armpit. From here I put the tight waist in on one side, and I put my hand down on the floor. Now, even as my training partner holds tight to my leg, from here I want to start an action of pulling back with one leg and slouching with the other. Okay, as we go down to our hip, I grab a hold of my own foot so I can lock the figure of 4 high in my training partner's armpit and make the necessary adjustments. You'll notice at no point do I go down to my shoulder. This is not the idea. I want height on my opponent, so I stay up on my hand, or at the very least on my elbow, but preferably my hand. And during this period, there is often adjustment with my hand to my own foot to ensure that the lock of my triangle is high in the armpit instead of low on the tricep. Now, from here, when my opponent goes to put me down, it's so easy for me to put weight into him and apply the stranglehold and get the finish. Okay, it's a very, very strong form of strangulation. Let's have a look at it again. My opponent gets deep in on the single leg, just like so. We start by pushing down on the head and the foot goes in. Okay, now my hand goes around my training partner's waist. I can't stay in this position because if my opponent lifts his head up, I would tend to fall off. Okay, because I'm committing my weight forward. So it's important in these situations that I start that slouch down to the mat. Now from here, I can't just have my knee and feet apart. If he pulls the elbow out, it's a disaster now. It's gone. Okay, so it's very, very important in these situations. My foot holds his tricep in place. It's like so. So when he goes to yank his arm free, there's resistance. I can't have my foot dangling in the breeze where the arm comes out. Now he gets a double leg, and all he has to do is free his head, and he's going to complete the takedown. So from here we pull up and we lock the figure of 4. Now from this position he goes to take me down. We're locked in place. We just apply the stranglehold and we get the finish. If for whatever reason the stranglehold is not adequate, I keep the tight waist and I grab my training partner's foot. Okay, the more I come around the corner, the stronger the strangle gets. And if for whatever reason the strangle proves to be inadequate, it's an easy thing to turn him over and put him on his back. Now once again, we find ourselves in that same Yoko Senkaku, and we strangle for the finish down on the mat. Let's have a look at this whole sequence again. Placido gets in on the single leg, down on the mat like so. From here we start by taking our foot around the corner. We go down to a tight waist. I pull his leg forward and we go down to a slouch position, just like so. I physically grab my foot and I pull everything high up into the armpit, making whatever adjustments are necessary to ensure that the lock is high in the armpit rather than low on the tricep. From here, we can just apply stranglehold directly. We can also go around the corner like so. So when he tries to lift me, it's very, very difficult, and the stranglehold kicks in the whole time. In addition, we can also put our opponent right over and lock up. You can always apply the stranglehold from top position. This is a highly effective sequence which we can often use against single legs down on the mat.